Hello, thank you for joining me and for letting me interview you. This is Jeffrey Overstreet, an actual film critic. So I have a source. That's what you are. You are my reliable source for this.
Oh,
Just start
reliable. Yeah.
reliable, right? Well, I'm also reliable. So, but just starting off, how did you become a film critic, and what made you interested in becoming a film critic?
Well, most kids kept diaries when they were small. I was fascinated with magazines and newspapers, and I grew up in a community that was very suspicious of the arts. So, and yet I was very drawn to the arts. That was the stuff in school that inspired me. Storybooks inspired me. I loved the library. I was drawn to the wide variety of storytelling and art in the library. And so in the daily newspaper, I gravitated to the arts section. And while I wasn't allowed to go to movies generally, I read movie reviews voraciously because that was how I could get close to the movies. That was how I could tease my imagination with all of the things I was missing out on. And there's something about forbidden fruit, right?
Yeah.
It has a certain appeal. So I was fascinated with that format, with this idea of summarizing something and then going into detail about what you appreciate about it. And so I started writing little reviews of all of the things I loved best, whether it was something I read or something I listened to. I started writing music reviews when I was about 11 or 12. I still have lists of my top 20 songs, like week by week when I was in high school. So that format of engaging the arts, writing about it, thinking about the arts, I was already realizing that in writing about something, I learned more about it. I thought better by writing. I have this little postcard on my desk, and I sort of live by that. I write because I don't know what I think until I read what I say. And so I guess I became a film critic just for myself, as a formal way of thinking through something. But I'm sure on some level, that was also a way of preparing my defense or my excuse for why I should be allowed to go see a movie or why I should be allowed to read certain books. So there was always this embedded argument pushing back against the restrictions of my community and saying, no, I think I should be allowed to see this and think about it for myself. How I became a film critic with an actual audience, though, when I graduated from SPU, I had been writing film reviews and music reviews for the Falcon. And I missed that. I missed the process of talking about art and thinking about art with the community. People were just getting their personal websites for the first time. The internet was just opening up. And so in search of a community that would talk on a regular basis about art, I started publishing film reviews and attracting the attention of Christians around the world who also loved film as an art form, but had trouble finding other Christians who wanted to treat it as such. And so we kind of found each other online and became this community. And it's amazing to see how 30 years later, how many of us went on to become published film critics, not just in Christian media, but elsewhere. So it was because of that Christianity Today invited me in 2001 to become their regular film columnist on their website. And I did that for about 10 years. So that was sort of how I got into it professionally.
Very nice. Are you working somewhere right now writing about film?
These days, I'm just writing about film for my own website. I occasionally contribute something to Image Journal, or if somebody asks me to write about something or appear on a podcast, I'll do that. But teaching has proven quite demanding, and I haven't yet figured out how I could contribute regularly as a film critic while also upholding the demands of that. And that's okay, actually, because my interest in the kinds of things I write about film have moved on beyond the usual Friday opening day review to much more exploratory, personal kinds of essays about the lasting influences of certain films in my life, or writing about film as a way of approaching a bigger subject, whether it's something happening politically or addressing a theological question. After about 20 years of writing regular reviews, I kind of got bored with the format. But I do post regularly on letterboxd.com, which is a really wonderful social media platform for people who love movies. And I will post just sort of off the cuff first impressions there. And I believe you will as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that sounds like a lot to balance anyways, trying to teach and still write film that's a lot.
It is. And writing fiction is my first love. So that comes first when I have writing time.
Yeah. All right. So next, how do you define film criticism?
Well, I guess I'm just sort of expanding on something I already said, and that is that to me, film criticism is just thinking about film in writing. Every Friday, well, not so much anymore since streaming has changed the model for this. But for so many decades, movies would open once a week. When I was growing up, you get 6 or 7 new movies in town every week. Now, every day, there are new things streaming all over the place. So there are the first impression reviews, which are often written to persuade people who are curious about whether or not this is worth their time. And that involves a lot of concerns about avoiding spoilers, but also sort of educating the reader about who's involved, what their track records have been elsewhere, making clear the genre, what's familiar, what's new and unfamiliar, what's well done, what's not so well done. That's a very useful form of criticism, and probably on the map of criticism, that's probably the freeway system. Those are the big roads with lots of traffic all the time, rush hour whenever new movies open. But there are these wonderful meandering avenues of criticism that are ways for people to write about themselves and what movies open up in them, what movies help them express about themselves or reveal to them about themselves. My book, Through a Screen Darkly, is kind of a personal history of my engagement with films. But on a deeper level, it's really using movies as a way of talking about faith, as a way of talking about how I grew into the beliefs, by which I see and understand the world. Most of my favorite critics write with a mix of sort of artistic analysis, personal reflection, and they have an eye on some bigger question that reminds us that we shouldn't treat film as some closed thing, as something that's just in and of itself an end, but that film is a means by which we can think about what's important in our lives. So for me, film criticism is just all the meaningful ways we can think about and talk about film, not arriving at a judgment, hopefully, but as a way of, the word essay it's a journey to set out on a journey with a movie, to develop a relationship with a movie. And film criticism is sort of a document of that writer's relationship with the movie at that particular moment.
Kind of going off of that, and you kind of already answered it, but what value do you place in film criticism?
Wow. I could write books about that. I have come to appreciate films I didn't like the first time by reading about them. I have discovered films I would never have seen by reading about them. I have met some of my closest friends by reading what they wrote about movies and then deciding I really needed to talk to these people. I have also, though, really grown in my appreciation of other forms of art, music, photography, acting, stage productions, writing, all kinds of writing. And I would have a hard time, like I said, I would have a hard time talking about my faith, my personal journey of faith without talking about conversations about movies have changed that. So yeah, the value, it's hard to pin that down.
Yeah. I'm just asking the heavy questions,
Yeah. Let me highlight one more thing there.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really timely. Right now, it's really difficult for me to talk to certain people I know about certain subjects, mostly political subjects. Some of those subjects get very personal and people feel very, very passionately about them. And if you talk to them about the issue, they feel confronted. And that can get very contentious very quickly. However, a movie that engages that question in some way can give you something to put on the table and look at together and discuss what's going on in the movie and the choices and consequences and priorities of the characters in such a way that sometimes you can have a meaningful exchange about a controversial subject without that sort of contentious confrontational aspect. And you can both come away with something a little more to think about and nobody feels attacked. And that, I think, is one of the greatest values of art in general. So the value of film criticism, to some extent, is also the way in which it enables us to talk about things without taking things so personally.
I really like that point. That's a really good point. And next, do you have a set of criterion for rating movies? If so, what is your criteria?
Well, sometimes that's bound to the particulars of whatever website I'm working with. I mean, if I've just seen something and I go to Letterboxd to share my first impressions, I can make a few notes, and then Letterboxd gives me the option of a 0 to 5 star rating, right? But then they also have this little heart and you can select that. What do these things mean? It's hard to describe. I use those like this. I will use the star rating as a way of saying, well, take this with an entire shaker of salt, but my first impression of this is I am this enthusiastic about it. I am 4 stars enthusiastic about it. But there I'm probably talking about the artistry, like how well it is made. Now the little heart is going to tell you whether I liked it or not. And that's a different thing. There are a lot of terrible movies that I really love. I would give them 2 stars out of 5 and then click on the heart. There are a lot of great films that are undeniably masterpieces that have changed filmmaking, that have influenced generations of filmmakers. And I watch them and I go, you know, I can appreciate why this is so great. I mean, obviously, this was done for the first time. No one's done this better. We continue to interpret this film in new ways, and I'm just not feeling it. And that's because we're very different people with very different experiences and very different interests, very different fears. We come from particular cultures with particular languages and family histories. All of that is at work when you look at any work of art for the first time. So rating is very subjective and not to be trusted. And I can tell who I'm going to get along with in the world of movies when I find somebody who actually reads what somebody writes about a film and then forgets or doesn't look at all at the rating, because the rating tells you so little, and it's probably going to be different the next day anyway, the next time they look at that thing. So I don't really have a set criteria. What I find useful is how different kinds of ratings can tell us about different aspects of the film, whether somebody is commenting, like I said, on the artistry of a thing, or their enthusiasm about a thing. And so, you know, I do spend a lot of time rating things just as a way of sort of organizing priorities. But that's not where the real meaningful conversation happens.
Have you ever been hesitant to release a film review because you held an unpopular opinion of the film?
I don't think I have, because I kind of like to stir things up. And when I was writing for Christianity Today, I knew that I was writing for a readership that was largely going to prefer movies that made Christianity look good, and they were not particularly concerned about artistry. And I wanted to challenge them. I wanted to teach, maybe that was arrogant of me, but I wanted to encourage people to think about the nature of art and what makes something a great work of art, and how what makes something a great work of art is not necessarily that you agree with it or that it reflects your view of the world. A great view of art challenges you to think about the world in new ways. So, for example, when The Passion of the Christ came out, most of the people around me in church-going culture were celebrating this as a major event in Hollywood history, and maybe a sign that Christians were gaining ground in the culture wars. And I looked at it as a work of art, and I was very impressed by some things about it and very troubled by others. And I wrote about both. And I knew that was going to be a problem for a lot of readers. And wow, it was. A tsunami of angry mail came to me. But for those who are actually interested in a legitimate conversation, I had some really wonderful conversations, and even some friendships came out of that. There was a similar sort of thing when The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe opened. Generations of moviegoers, and especially Christian moviegoers, have been looking forward to something like this. And I was just kind of mixed on the actual final movie. And I think I leaned more positive than I really intended to in my first review, and then read it again a couple of weeks later and was like, oh boy, I blew it. I think I may have given in a little bit to peer pressure there. And I would write a very different review now. Where it gets tricky is that the more years I spend writing about film, the more filmmakers I meet, and the more friends of mine who have been aiming at becoming filmmakers become filmmakers. And then I get into these compromising situations where I actually see their movies, and they're expecting that I will write effusively enthusiastic things about those films. And sometimes I see them and I go, well, I can respect what you've done and all the hard work you put into it, and so I've been in a difficult place sometimes, where I have to start with a disclaimer that I'm well acquainted with the filmmakers and I have great affection for them and admiration for what they do, but I'm not an honest critic if I don't say that I think these things don't quite measure up. Those are the most difficult moments, I think, for me as a critic. Fortunately, in the last few years, most of the filmmakers I know who are making movies have been doing extraordinary work. I've known the filmmaker Lee Isaac Chung for about 10 years now, and his new film, according to Letterboxd, is the most admired, celebrated film of 2020. And that just thrills me because I think it's a beautiful movie. So it's called Minari, by the way. If you haven't seen it, it will be streaming in just a few weeks. Yeah, I think that's the best answer I can give.
Yeah. Very nice. Very nice. Do you read other critics' film reviews? If so, who is your favorite film critic?
Oh man. The easy answer is the first one. I read every day. I read film reviews. Probably every week I read somebody I haven't read before, because I want to discover, like I said, I want to discover new things. I want to discover new ways of thinking about things I've seen. And frankly, I just always want to find out if somebody has discovered something I love. Favorite film critics. One favorite film critic would be hard to say. I mean, Roger Ebert looms large. Because he's America's beloved film critic. He was the most prolific, and he wrote so masterfully and so accessibly. So many people fell in love with movies, including me, because of it. So I probably owe Roger Ebert the greatest debt. These days, I love reading, and have loved reading for 20 years, Stephen D. Greydonis, who writes at decentfilms.com, and he also writes for the National Catholic Register. I always learn something when I read him. He's also just a magnificent writer, and he too learned from Ebert, sort of modeled his writing, I think, after Ebert. But there are also critics who really challenge me, who talk about films I would never discover otherwise in a vocabulary that I do not speak, that challenges me to learn new terms. So I'm a big fan of a guy named Michael Sosinski, who's a little hard to find, but He writes, he is an explorer of cinema and writes about things that I would never have discovered otherwise. I'm also a big fan of Alyssa Wilkinson, who writes for Vox.com. We have a lot of history and have moved in a lot of the same circles. And I'm just so excited about what an incredible job she's doing. Her career is a remarkable story. And I love the passion and the discipline that she pours into her work. So she's important to me as well. I guess I will stop there, although in 5 minutes I'm going to think of 10 more people that I really should have mentioned.
That's what always ends up happening, right?
Yes.
I mean, it was a hard question to answer. I understand. All right. What, in your opinion, is the greatest film ever made?
Well, you've probably figured out by now that I don't have short answers. What do you mean by greatest, I guess? And that's a rhetorical question, but do you mean the film that is the most influential and awe-inspiring and innovative? Do you mean the film that means the most to me? Do you mean the film that will reach across the most borders and last the longest? It's such a complicated question. Every 10 years, a huge list of film critics gets together and working with the British Film Institute and their magazine Sight and Sound, they do a poll on the greatest films ever made. And for 50 years, Orson Welles' Citizen Kane was #1 on that list. And it's easy to see why. I mean, so many innovations in filmmaking happened there, and it was a great story, and it was beautifully acted, and it was great on every level. So that now it seems like every great filmmaker at some point ends up talking about Citizen Kane, or if you're David Fincher and you end up with all these resources at your disposal and you're one of the greats of your day, what do you do when you have the opportunity? You make a movie about the making of Citizen Kane called Mank, and it gets a lot of attention. I've never really liked Citizen Kane. You know, I can admire all those things about it, but when I watch it, I don't find it terribly engaging, and I'm in the minority on that, obviously. In 2012, that movie was knocked off of the top spot in the Decade Critics poll, and Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo was voted #1. Yasujiro Ozu's Tokyo Story was #3, and as you go down the list, you see a lot of the same films just sort of playing musical chairs. I can point to any of those and tell you why they're on that list. But I love Vertigo. I didn't the first time. I thought it was boring. I thought it was troubling. The more I watched it, the more troubling it became. And then pretty soon I started really appreciating why I'm being troubled and how I should be troubled, and how this movie is doing a good work by troubling people about these things in the world. But I also admire how generation by generation people read the movie differently, and how great filmmakers of today are still trying to achieve some of the things that Vertigo achieves. However, if I were to give you a list of my top 10 personal favorite movies, it wouldn't be on the list because it hasn't spoken to me personally in a meaningful way. So I would point to, more likely, Three Colors Blue right here over my shoulder, which I have seen 20 times at least. And every time I see new things, and it speaks to me so personally about things that are so important to me. Wim Wenders' film Wings of Desire also speaks directly about things that are the questions I care about most in the world, and there's probably no movie I think of more often than that movie. If I buy a cup of coffee, which happens almost every day, I think of Wings of Desire, because there is such a beautiful moment when somebody buys their first cup of coffee and it changes their life. But if I look at the whole story of my life, I'm probably going to end up pointing to the Muppet movie, or maybe Star Wars, the original, or Babette's Feast, which was probably the first heavily subtitled foreign film that got my attention, and that had a profound influence on my faith. So, a very complicated question. And if you ask me again in 10 years, I'll probably name different movies.
Yes, that is an incredibly hard question. I remember I was doing research on like what is like people's like what is the greatest film ever made, right? And yeah, the Sight and Sound, like their whole list popped up, and it's interesting to see how it's like it's the same movies that just like they just move around.
Yeah, and I think the critics, I mean, for good reasons, they're drawn to the big movies. I mean, the Tree of Life, I think in the last 10 years is probably the movie most likely to end up near the top of that list someday, because few movies have been as ambitious as that one. But for me, sometimes it's the smallest, quietest movies that achieve the most remarkable effects. There's a film called The Sun, which I think I showed in a class you were in. That's just about a carpentry teacher who takes a strange interest in one of his students. And the relationship between that man and that boy starts out by scaring the daylights out of the audience because they think it's going to go a certain way. But then as the secrets of that relationship are revealed, by the end of the movie, you are watching one of the most difficult stories of one human being's decision that I've ever seen. And it's such a profound story about humility, about forgiveness, about reconciliation. So sometimes I think the greatest films just don't have the stuff that immediately impresses people enough to register. But if you give them time and attention, they will be the ones that do the greatest work on your heart.
Okay. And now I have a couple of questions from my friends that they wanted to ask.
Okay.
And the first one is, what are your opinions based on? Some reviews seem overly critical at times. And I know you kind of addressed that, but maybe you can go in more detail on that.
Well, people often assume that critics are snobs. They'll look at Rotten Tomatoes and they'll be like, well, the audience really liked that movie, and obviously they were right because I liked it too, and not very many critics liked it. But you have to remember that audience reviews are often first impressions based on people coming right out of the theater, and they're still starry-eyed, and they haven't really stopped and thought things through. And so we're back to, I don't know what I think till I see what I say. Critics write about the movie, so they're thinking them through, and that leads them to all kinds of detailed analysis. And that will appear to some people as snobbery. But if you were to turn things around and ask those people what they care most about, what they have the biggest vocabulary about, maybe it's football. If you were to sit with them and watch a football game, they would be nitpicking little things that you don't understand at all. And you could so easily just say, well, what a football snob. But what's really happening is you're listening to an expert about what they know best. And when you go to Rotten Tomatoes and look at those scores, what you're seeing is a general impression across a large body of people who see 300 movies a year. And most people I know, they're lucky if they see 10 a year. So they have a much vaster frame of reference, and they're looking at a lot of different things that most people wouldn't even think to look at. I base my reviews on all kinds of things. I mean, I base it on, how I feel when I watch the movie. I base it on what it makes me think about. I base it on the quality of the acting, the quality of the editing, the quality of the cinematography, whether or not the musical score is just wallpaper or whether it's actually playing an instrumental, no pun intended, role in our visceral experience of the movie. I think about movies that have come before and what it's doing that's new and what it's doing that's familiar. But what it comes down to, I think if I had to boil it down to one question, and I just sort of stumbled onto this question a couple of years ago. And it was after I saw the movie Lady Bird. And there's a scene where the main character, I think her name is either Catherine or Christine, but she goes by Lady Bird, is talking to the nun who is the principal of her Catholic girls' school. And the nun is praising this essay that Lady Bird wrote about Sacramento. And Lady Bird's kind of like, what are you talking about? I hate it here. She's like, yes, but you pay such close attention. I think you love Sacramento because you write about it with such passion. And aren't those the same thing, love and attention? And I got to thinking about that, and I got to thinking, can a movie love something? Well, if love is attention, When I look at a movie, the question I think I end up thinking about the most is, what does this movie pay attention to? Does it pay attention to the nuances of its characters so that they seem human and three-dimensional? Does it pay attention to things that really matter? Does it pay attention to love? Does it pay attention to, or does it only pay attention to sensation? Does it only pay attention to excitement? Does it only pay attention to, can we keep people's attention on the screen all the time by constantly throwing things at them? Does it pay attention to our desire for revenge or our desire for reconciliation and peace? Those questions boil it down to sort of one essential question for me, which is, what does this movie love? I can look at Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino and say, this movie loves violence, but more than that, it loves color and sound and the different voices of its characters, and it loves the faces of its characters. There are so many extreme close-ups in Pulp Fiction. It loves the rhythms of great filmmaking. It loves the rhythms of great music. There is so much love in Pulp Fiction that I love that movie, even though I have some misgivings about some of the storytelling and what that storytelling is leading us toward. There are a lot of movies that are about love that are badly made and that don't show the filmmaker loves anything about the medium they're working in. So that has started to become a really rewarding question for me when I think about a film. And it's becoming, I guess, more and more the basis. I think those are the words you use, the basis of how I review a film.
Do you choose the films you review, or are you assigned them?
Well, it depends on what year you ask me. In the years, in the 8 or 9 years that I was writing sort of the opening day film review for Christianity Today, it was a mix. I could request, I could say, could I please cover this? For a few years, since I was the only critic there, that was possible. Then they hired a whole team because that was going well. And then it sort of became, like siblings elbowing for the biggest piece of cake. And I would ask for certain movies, and sometimes I'd get them, and sometimes Stephen Gradanis would get them, or Peter Chataway would get them, or Michael Leary would get them, or Alyssa Wilkinson would get them. So, I love remembering those days and sort of the friendly fights we had about things. It meant so much to me that I got to be the one to review the Lord of the Rings movies as they came out. That will probably always be sort of like a mountaintop experience for me, that I got to be there at that time, reviewing the movies of the books I had grown up loving the most. These days, around 2010 and a few years after that, I was writing regularly for Image, and I got to pick whatever movies inspired, for me, the most interesting thing to write about. And for my own website, I review whatever I want. So these days, it's that. Yeah, nobody's telling me what to see these days.
And then this one is maybe a little bit hard to answer, but what is the boldest film you've seen?
The boldest film I've seen. Well, when I think, again, it all depends on how you define bold. When I think of the word boldness in relation to movies, I think of filmmakers who are taking risks, who are trying things that haven't been tried before. So when I watch Vertigo and when I teach Vertigo, I'm very aware of just how many things Hitchcock was trying in that movie that may not have been tried before. So that's a film that comes to mind. I look back a lot at a couple of films, Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola, and 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick. Both of those did things that I don't know had ever been tried before. I mean, Star Wars was pretty bold too, but so much of what worked in Star Wars worked almost by accident. It should have been a terrible movie, and somehow, magically, everything worked. 2001: A Space Odyssey really demands a lot of the audience. There are moments in the movie that suggest to you what this movie is really about, but it's probably not going to be evident to you the first time you see it. A lot of, film scholars will talk about that famous edit in 2001: A Space Odyssey, where a caveman or an ape man throws like a femur bone up into the sky, and you see it sort of spinning in the air, and then there's a sudden cut, and you see a space station in space turning. And what just happened? Now we're in the future, but the way that cut can be read as poetry, as here we are, so advanced, humankind, so advanced, and yet we are still basically using blunt objects to obtain power over other people. And that's a very eloquent moment and a very bold choice for the filmmaker to trust the audience's intelligence to think about that and figure out what that might mean. In recent years, I think the boldest thing I've seen is The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick, because that's a movie that takes a very particular story of an American family and uses it to raise a question about the meaning of life, and then catapults us to the Big Bang, if you will, catapults us to the moment God speaks and the cosmos are created, and spends almost half an hour just watching celestial bodies form and merge and shift, and then Earth emerges, and then there is life, and then we see early life, and we see dinosaurs, which freaks people out because they don't know what's happening. And we arrive at Sean Penn, So that's a pretty bold move on Terrence Malick's part. Lately, I've just been increasingly impressed with what Spike Lee achieved with Do the Right Thing in 1989. That movie feels like it was made yesterday. And he's borrowing from lots of other filmmakers who influenced him to make something completely new. And I really missed the boat on that in 1989. I think I saw it, but I don't think I really had any sense of what I was seeing. And now I look at it and go, man, that was a gutsy movie. That was a visionary movie. Those are examples that come to mind. I am embarrassed at how little attention I've given to women in film over the years. And I'm trying to make up for that now by giving special attention to women who have been in filmmaking for decades and never got appreciated, and women who are making movies now. And I think that's influencing my thinking, because when I look at my top 10 movies of this last year, almost all 10 of them were made by women. And that wasn't me deciding to do that. That just shows you that love is attention. And I was giving those movies a lot of attention, and I fell in love with a lot of them.
Well, I just only have one last question for you, which is, what is some advice you would give to someone who is interested in pursuing a career in film criticism?
Well, I could save you a lot of time by letting you know that you can look this up. I've written an article called Letters to a Young Film Critic for Comment Magazine several years ago. And it's basically like a top 10 list of suggestions to people who want to become film critics. One of the things I talk about there is I think people should write first as exploration, as a way of thinking about things, as a way of discovering what you think. I recommend that they read film critics voraciously, like I said earlier, to learn and absorb all the different forms that can take, to learn what's happening in the conversations before you try and join it, so you don't embarrass yourself. But don't be ruled by fear either. I mean, take risks and join conversations. But I think also, just on a practical note, it's important not to hurt yourself by thinking you're going to have a career in film criticism. It may be that those days are over. Most people I know, even the most accomplished, most famous, most widely published film critics, have a very steady job doing something else as well. There was a day where the best of the best made careers of it, but I think the internet has ruined that. Not that that's a bad thing. It's given everybody a voice and expanded the boundaries of the conversation exponentially, and helped overcome the fact that the people who had careers as film critics were very privileged people. Now it's an international conversation across income levels, across disciplines. And I think that's awesome. So you have to do it because you love it. If you don't love the experience of sitting down for hours and writing about something that you watched in 90 minutes, you probably want to do other things. But I have no regrets. I love writing about movies. When I see a movie, I cannot wait to start writing about it. I cannot wait to read what other people have written about it. And that has enriched my life beyond measure.
Was there anything else that you wanted to say or anything you want to bring up?
I guess I could mention that I really wonder about the future of film criticism. I really wonder if it's just going to become a conversation between an increasingly or a decreasing number of people. Because more and more, every year I notice a dramatic shift. Fewer and fewer people are watching movies. More and more people are binge watching TV shows. More and more people are invested in games. More and more people are invested in social media and, TikTok and things like that, which are legitimate art forms. I feel like there will be a great loss because cinema allows us to do these deep dives into things, whereas television is driven more by a priority to keep people watching. And in prioritizing that, you hurt storytelling. The storytelling is shaped by consumer interests. What is going to keep people coming back to another season of The Mandalorian? Well, if we get Mark Hamill into an episode of The Mandalorian, that's going to make people come back next time because they're going to wonder what they're going to see this time. And so the arc of the story is shaped largely by nostalgia and by celebrity, by fan bases, by fan interests, fan services, they say. Cinema at its best is not about that. It's about creating something whole and new and challenging that's going to ask people to step outside of their comfort zones and learn and grow. So I'm concerned about that. To some extent, that's just, I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to have old man concerns. And old man concerns are, well, the world's changing and people don't like what I like. So I hope it's not that. I hope it's that there really is something unique about the world of movies. And instead of just investing 75 hours in several seasons of one thing, you can spend 75 hours and travel the world and hear many different voices and see many different visions and have so much more to talk about. So that's a trend I'm thinking about a lot. And so I'm sad when I ask my students, who's heard of Wes Anderson, and only one or two people raise their hands, because he is a contemporary filmmaker doing important work. But on the other hand, I'm learning a lot from my students about the things they love, the things they pay attention to, the things they write about. So it's an interesting exchange. It's a meaningful exchange.
Yeah, I definitely know from my experience of talking with my friends when I've been like, well, like, what movies do you like? Because all I talk about is movies, right? And they'll be like, well, I don't really watch movies because they're too long. I'm like, yeah, but you just sat down for 4 hours and binge watched a show. And I'm like, I'm not connecting the dots here.
Yeah, I think it's something about sustained attention. When you watch a movie, you are sitting still for 2 hours and you don't have something to break you out of it and remind you of the real world, and you take a breath. Cinema is demanding because it asks you to immerse and not come up for air for a while. And that inflicts a kind of suffering. You don't have the relief of being able to hit pause and go somewhere. Well, you probably do if you're watching movies at home. But if you're in a theater, you got to sit there. You've spent money on this. You got to sit there in the dark until it's over. And I could think of a lot of movies I wouldn't care nearly as much about if I had been watching them at home, and I could have stopped them at certain points. But because I had to sit there to the end, I often was uncomfortable and came away thinking I didn't really like that. But then with time and reflection and thinking about what I really experienced there, I have these little epiphanies and I realize, I think I want to see that again. I think it taught me patience, and it also taught me to listen to people. when you are in control all the time and can always turn something off as soon as you decide this just isn't for you, you're not developing the skills to sit and listen to somebody who, as soon as they get on your nerves, you're going to want to walk away from. I wonder if this has anything to do with what's happening with marriages these days. You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think on some level, maybe it does. So yeah, that's an interesting conversation.
Yeah. Because it's something that I've thought about too, because I'm like, no one wants to watch movies with me because they're too long. But I'm like, whatever, I'll just watch it by myself.
I'll go watch whatever season of Ozark you're into now, and you could have watched a dozen movies.
Exactly.
No offense to Ozark, I've never seen an episode, so I have nothing against that show.
Yeah. I guess also kind of on that note, I have one more question that's not super related, but do you think movie theaters are going to die after COVID?
No. I think there will still be huge screens for big movies like Christopher Nolan movies and Marvel movies and movies that in a very competitive environment, more competitive than ever, that somehow generate a big audience, because something in us wants that big communal experience. However, when it comes to other kinds of movies, I think big cities will have a few art house theaters for people who have discovered cinema and who love it. I think there will probably be novelty theaters where people can go and watch the latest Doctor Who episode with all of their, I almost said Whoville, but that's Dr. Seuss. With all their Whovians. What do you call Who fans?
I think they're Whovians.
Okay. I'm just seeing a bunch of vacuum cleaners, but those are Hoovers. I won't be surprised if venues open up that invite fan bases together to celebrate. It got to the point where it was kind of scary for me to go to a new Star Wars movie because everybody else was showing up in costume and cheering wildly during the movie, and we were missing important dialogue. But yeah, I don't think it's ever going to be the same. Seattle was such an extraordinary city for a while, with more than a dozen great art house theaters and more than a dozen great cineplexes for the big stuff. And there was just a whole world of movies available to you every weekend. And I don't think that's ever coming back. It just isn't a sustainable business model, I don't think. So the people who figure out how to get an audience for something, they're going to probably corner the market on that. It won't be a room for a lot of competition. I think businesses will fail trying. But no, I don't think it's over yet. We'll see. I mean, it depends on how regularly pandemics become a thing.
That's very true. It's very true. I'm kind of of the same mindset of like, I don't think movie theaters are going to die. I do think they'll be different, but I really miss going to the movies.
Yeah. I don't think professional sports are going to die,
No.
And they have a pretty built-in audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have anything else that you would like to?
I think I will spare people.
Okay.
Any further rambling.
Okay. Well,
but if you have follow-up questions, we can always, do a PS,
exactly. Yeah.
Bonus features, deleted scenes or whatever.
Deleted scenes. Yes, exactly. Well, thank you again so much for taking time out of your schedule.
It was a blast. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, of course. You're like the only film critic that I know, so you were the only source that I knew.